Yeah, I guess this is a year in review. Hopefully, yeah, there's not too many slides. There's around 30 slides. Hopefully I can, maybe there's quite a bit of slides. Maybe I can go through, the parts that I've already gone through in detail relatively quickly. I really want to, I guess, like take time to talk about what I took away from some of these projects and what are the key next steps that I think could be taken. So yeah, questions are welcome. All right, cool. Yeah, so I guess my time here started last August, and it's August now, so it's been a year. 4 key projects that I was working on. One was the Dendrites project. The next was sort of like a deep dive into spatial, polar, and temporal memory. Then I kind of wanted to integrate that into Monty, so that began the temporal memory for Monty project. And I guess for the last 2 or 3 months, I've been working on grid cells for Monty. Okay, so the Dendrites project, just a very brief recap. I guess this project started before I joined, but I came and contributed a few things. One of the key intuitions for this project was that they started looking at neurons in deep learning, and we kind of started comparing them to real pyramidal neurons in the neocortex. And the basic idea was that artificial neurons are really vast oversimplifications of what's really happening. On the left, you see an artificial neuron diagram where it's a soma is basically replicated as a linear weighted sum, and the axon is kind of like the output of a nonlinearity. But in reality, this is not at all how dendrites work, or this is not at all how neurons work. Neurons have basically thousands and thousands of synapses, and these dendritic segments kind of act as independent pattern recognizers by checking to see if a set of synapses are connected or not. And this is what depolarizes the neuron, the cell body, to fire. And this is like this is a deep complexity that's completely missing in deep learning. And this was sort of the impetus for the Dendrites project. So the first part was kind of augmenting the standard point neuron, the artificial neuron model. On the bottom, you see the feed-forward input, and this is like the standard part of an artificial neuron. But the key contribution here was adding context vectors, which kind of mimic basal dendrites. And these context vectors, you have one weight per segment per se, and you would feed a context into this area. You would kind of compute which segment has the maximal response to that context vector, and that would modulate whether the neuron fires or not. So yeah, I'm going to try to go step by step here. This is like the full architecture this was the key contribution of that paper. The first contribution was adding dendrites to the standard point neuron. The second one was adding sparse weights, and that's the thing you see at the bottom. Instead of a fully connected dense layer where all neurons of one layer are connected to all neurons of the second layer, we kind of drew some inspiration from the neuroscience, and we decided to say that these connections should really be sparse. This would basically reduce the sort of gradient interference that you see with most deep networks, and that would probably help alleviate catastrophic forgetting, in like dynamic environments and dynamic training scenarios. And the third contribution was adding sparse activations instead of the classic, ReLU activation, which I think in its best case only gates maybe 50% of the neurons to be active. But here we sort of introduced a variable sparse activation where only the top K neurons become active. So, like I said, this project was well underway before I got here. I think most of the continual learning experiments were already run. I started working on the multitask reinforcement learning experiments. And this was basically looking at this environment setup called the MetaWorld V2 benchmark, where you have this robotic arm and needs to solve a bunch of these tasks. And you would ideally learn all 10 of these tasks together using some reinforcement learning algorithm. But a standard deep network would really struggle to do this because when it's learning one task and you're also trying to learn an orthogonal task, 2 tasks that don't have any semantic overlap, you would see a lot of gradient interference during training. But this is something that we really tried mitigating by introducing this active dendrites network. So some of the results here, I think this is just for the reinforcement learning experiments. With dendrites, which used about 7.2 million parameters, we had a model that had about an 88% average accuracy across 10 of these tasks. A regular deep network with maybe about 500,000 more parameters was far less accurate, about 11% less accurate. And an even larger MLP just showed that, adding more parameters doesn't solve anything, even though the large MLP had about 2 million more parameters than our dendrites model. All it showed was that no matter how large you go, you'll still have problems like catastrophic interference and gradient interference when training orthogonal tasks. So yeah, this was cool to see. Yeah, and this was like one of the key figures of the paper where we kind of see that a neuron in this model for both multitask reinforcement learning and the continual learning permuted MNIST experiments that Karan was working on, you kind of see that before training and after training, how selective a neuron responds to a particular task. What you don't want to see is that a neuron responds to all tasks, but you see here that it responds selectively, which means that we kind of see these subnetworks automatically forming in our deep network that correspond to different tasks. And these subnetworks are automatically non-overlapping when they don't need to be, and overlapping when they kind of share knowledge. So that was cool. Yeah, we got some good, I guess, PR out of this paper. We published something in the Frontiers in Neurorobotics journal. That was cool. All of us gave like a small talk at Yannick Kilcher's YouTube video. That was cool too. Just recently, Subutai, Karan, and me presented something at the Sparsity in Neural Networks workshop about this work. And just last Sunday, me and Karan recorded a podcast for the AutoML. It's the AutoML podcast. They wanted to hear more about how dendrites might help stuff like neural architecture search. So that was cool.
Just a question for for this slide, or the one before with the context. Did you guys have time to like play around with sort of task composition, like where you could sort of have maybe a similar task that you try and generalize to, and you kind of recall a similar context, or like composing two contexts that have been learned for a task that requires both of them, or something like that?
That's actually an interesting idea. I don't think we tried that. We used like fixed context vectors, and we kind of let the dendrite segments learn whether a particular task was semantically similar to another task, but the context vectors themselves were entirely orthogonal to each other. They were just like one-hot encoded vector IDs describing the task.
Yeah, okay.
But it would be also a criticism of permuted MNIST is that it's like really difficult to study transfer of knowledge across tasks, because the tasks are basically, I mean, they're the same task, but they're basically independent because they've been permuted.
Right. I guess, yeah, like a really simple example might be to like split MNIST into the first and the last 5 classes and like train separately on both of those with different contexts, and then see if you can kind of superimpose the context vectors to handle both situations, like classification across all 10.
Yeah, that is a good idea.
But yeah. Cool. No, but yeah, really interesting. I'm sad there's not a screenshot of you of the sunglasses.
I don't need the reminder. There's a reason I put this picture up instead of the one where I didn't have sunglasses. That was just, yeah. Okay, so I guess like what's next? We briefly talked about how sparse, we could use dendrite segments with sparse weights instead of dense ones. We didn't really explore that, but it was talked about. But going back to, I guess, to what Niels, you were talking about, I think definitely more compelling benchmarks would be interesting. Not many papers explore this notion of continual reinforcement learning, but I think that would have been really cool to try instead of multitask reinforcement learning. And instead of permuted MNIST, where instead of learning all these 10 tasks together for like a complicated robot setup like the one I showed, you learn them in sequence and you don't see all tasks after you finish learning on them. Another interesting thing I think that could be tried is more realistic dendrites. Right now we treat dendrites as like standalone context processors. They're like floating weights that don't really get touched except when they're updated by backprop. But what we could do is make more realistic ones where we connect neurons laterally via dendrite segments. So within a particular layer. Just food for thought.
Yeah, that's not really a more realistic dendrite. So it's more of a more realistic architecture, right?
Yeah, I should say more realistic deep learning dendrites.
Well, it's not. It's really you're using the dendrites, but the change here would be connections between cells in a layer. Right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
All right. So it's not really making the dendrites more realistic. It's more realistic neural architecture, just to be clear.
Yeah, that's right.
And of course, we did do that in other places. Of course, the whole temporal memory is built on that idea.
Yeah, I guess this is like purely for like a, okay, onto the fun stuff. I did a nice deep dive into the spatial pooler and temporal memory stuff because that was something I really wanted to work on when I first started. But we were working on the dendrites project, so we wrapped that up, got some really good, nice results from that. And then starting January, I worked on like this sort of deep dive and trying to understand, all the nuances behind the spatial pooler and temporal memory algorithms. When I was exploring this, I found that all the existing code, or the fastest versions of the code, had been written in C++ and linked to Python via some PyBind library. So one of the key things here is that it worked quickly, but it was hard to decipher and learn. It was really hard to optimize the algorithm. It was also built on this really, really abstract sparse matrix library called sparse matrix connections, which is something I think Marcus wrote. And it's very, very detailed. It works very well, but it's also very hard to improve and optimize. So yeah, that was like my first thought when I started doing this deep dive. What I ended up doing was, for better or for worse, kind of reproducing all of the spatial pooler and all of the temporal memory code purely in Python. And I think anyone can use that now. If anyone goes to the frameworks/HTM folder inside Lupic Research, they can find like the spatial pooler that has been written completely in Python, or the temporal memory algorithms, which have been written completely in PyTorch. And yeah, this is like a snippet of all those three.
Would those implementations be slower than the C++?
Yeah, I'm getting there.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I would like to say, this is like the most readable code I've ever seen. This is like, you almost can read the code and like see what's in the paper directly. So it may be slower, but it's incredibly instructive.
Thank you, Ben.
Well, I'm just trying to understand the point of it. Because sometimes we spend huge amounts of efforts trying to make things fast, like moving away from Python. And now you're going the opposite direction. You're moving to Python. It just, I'm not questioning it. I'm just saying it's like funny because we spend all this time optimizing things in C, and now you find out you want to go back to Python. So
yeah. So I guess you're right. But one of the things I did when I started this was, my first intention wasn't to make it faster. I already thought it was pretty fast. My intention was to make a readable version of the code where anyone could understand the algorithm just by reading the code. And I guess that would improve, if you really wanted to build upon the algorithm, you would do so here in this prototyped version and then move it to C++ to become faster. That was my idea. But in terms of speed, so this is like a questionable outcome of if anything here was useful or not. The Python spatial pooler is readable and it's fast and it's also easy to build upon. So that's good. It's almost as fast as the C++ version, but it's negligible. You could use either and be perfectly fine. The temporal memory one was a pain though, but the code is readable, but the runtime is really, really slow compared to the C++ version. And I moved it to PyTorch specifically so that I could run it both on CPU and GPU. But I realized that even if I did move it to GPU, the operations that were happening for the sparse matrix multiplications are still inefficient. Moving it to GPU won't really change that. So I guess like the biggest outcome of this was that it's a good learning tool to grasp all the nuances of the algorithm for anyone who's starting in HTM.
how much slower was it? I mean, just roughly.
26 times slower from the last experiments that I ran. Yeah, it's really slow.
That's significant.
One thing you should know, defaultly, the way that sometimes they do these operations, that they take the sparse representation, blow it out to a dense one before feeding it down the normal path and then reconverting the results back. So
I was exploring using some of those sparse libraries. Like
Yeah.
that was something I was gonna do, but I never got to do. So like what I'm doing here is actually a dense matmul. Like I intended to do a
Right.
dense matmul, and it was just stupid.
Well, I mean, they could have changed it when I looked at it, down at the deepest level, the A10 level, ATN
Yeah.
level. They're just doing dense multiplies. The only savings is in storage representation. But so you shouldn't. The fact that it's even slower than that is a testament to the cost, I guess, of moving back and forth between the representations.
Yeah. There are some good takeaways from this though. One thing that we were talking about a lot, or I was talking about a lot, but I never got to do, was using the spatial pooler to create SDRs of image patches. We were always, like in all our Monty experiments, we were kind of facing this problem head on of how do we create SDRs from real value data? And I presented some stuff in the temporal memory section where I used this like coordinate encoder strategy where I was kind of taking real value numbers and trying to create them into SDRs. But one of the interesting things I wanted to try was using the spatial pooler to automatically do this for image patches. I never got to do that, but interesting idea. Maybe someone can do that in the future. The temporal memory stuff. So even though the code that I wrote was, not really fast, much faster compared to the C++ version, what we realized was when I tried temporal memory in the Monty project, the C++ version actually was still very, very slow after ingesting a lot of data. And the reason for this was twofold. One was that you're not deleting unused dendritic segments. You're just going to create segments as they go. And so the sparse matrix just becomes exponentially bigger. And the other thing is that sparse matrix multiplication in the C++ version still uses for loops to basically compute a matmul. And while it is relatively efficient because you're only going to loop over the non-zero values, we're still using a for loop here. And I feel like that could be done better. So maybe the next step would be to write a C++ version without any sparse matrix multiplication at all. I remember Subutai and I were talking about this very briefly, but we were brainstorming this notion where you could use pointers to basically calculate the synaptic overlap between a given SDR and a set of dendritic segments instead of doing a sparse or dense matrix multiplication. And I feel like this is pretty mission critical because if we used temporal memory, the current C++ version, in any of the Monty experiments, you're really limited by how much data you can ingest. If you wanted to really use HTM to its fullest benefits, then we would have to maybe rewrite parts of this C++ algorithm.
I'm trying to remember. It's a little surprising because when we first did the temporal memory, I used to always refer to something I called fixed resources. I mean, in brains, you just can't add, segments willy-nilly, and neurons just don't get bigger and bigger and bigger. This growth and things can happen, but the number of neurons doesn't change quickly, and in most parts of the brain, and the size of the dendritic trees don't. So a realistic neural model would have constraints. It says we got a fixed amount of resources and you have to reallocate them as you go. And I think we did a lot of modeling doing it that way for this very reason, because if you just keep adding dendritic segments, it will slow down. You can't do it forever. So I don't remember the history here, but I'm surprised that that's in there like that, as opposed to more of a resource constrained network. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So Lewis and Subutai told me the same, but those versions are probably no longer runnable because they're either written in an old version of C++, or the Python bindings are also very old. And right before Marcus left, he kind of translated some version of temporal memory to C++, which is runnable, and that's this version.
Okay, well, so fine, but I mean, if we think about the future of these things, I mean, that's what we should probably be heading towards, going back there, whether it's, just because it's not runnable today. The problem is, that you can't just keep adding resources, indefinitely. So that's probably the solution to those problems. At least say very interesting ways about how does the system degrade as you fill up the resources and you can't add more and you have to sort of trade off. And I think one of the things we found and it made sense logically, was that the system tends to generalize more. It tends to say, well, things it could see as different in the beginning, and now sort of groups them together. And which is a nice failure mode in some sense. It's not like an incorrect failure. It's just you just sort of, you know, or unless you over time you lose the differentiation between specific events and things like that. Anyway, everyone should know that if we want to work with this in the future, we ought to be thinking about fixed resources. Also, I'm a question about what's the problem with for loops? It's maybe a stupid question, but why are for loops inherently bad?
I think they're done sequentially. So if you wanted to compute a map mole, you probably wouldn't want to do it sequentially. You want to do
there's nothing wrong about them algorithmically. It's just that it doesn't allow for parallelization. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
The way it's written, it doesn't.
Okay, thanks.
One of the problems is if you're going across a thing, deciding whether to multiply or not, each mispredicted if is extremely expensive. It's like 30 cycles worth. So the more you can run the code sequentially, deterministically, the better off you are with these CPU architectures.
So where is that, Kevin, and that comes up? So as in if you have a logic statement within the for loop?
Yeah, if you have the for loop itself, obviously has a conditional on it, but once it goes through it the first time, it's able to predict where the next instruction is at the bottom of the loop. So it's not so much the fact that there's an if, it's the fact that if it's a random value that you can't reliably predict what which way the code flows. What happens is if it mispredicts, it's got to abandon a deep stack of partial results and reload the instruction cache from that, and that's what's expensive. In the time that you take a mispredicted branch, you could probably do about 128 multiplies. So that's why it's really expensive to have mispredicted branches.
In this code, there's no conditionals inside the for loop. It's already somewhat optimized, but we're only going to iterate over the non-zero indices. And we have that knowledge beforehand.
How do you determine which one's the non-zero?
You add them like that. Like you always keep track of which indices are non-zero. Okay, so then the other problem is then you're doing a gather operation. It's still, yeah.
So then you have the coherency of the access to the memory being not cache coherent, and that's the other side of the thing. So
yeah. Okay,
but good. I mean, you didn't do it brain damagely, but
yeah.
When you mentioned the for loop, that's why I was kind of thinking that it might have been that simple.
Mm.
Okay. Anyway.
Okay. I presented this project before, maybe 2 months ago. This was temporal memory for Monty, and the whole idea here was, can we use temporal memory to achieve sample invariance? Basically, can I disambiguate between many objects while observing features at locations on that object surface? This is like a kind of like a roadmap diagram that I presented at one of the lunch meetings, maybe also 2 months ago. And this is sort of like a summary of all the projects that were happening 2 months ago. The first was Vivian's graph learning, which was, I guess, one of the more important things about that was that it's invariant to scale and orientation. Karan reproduced the vector neurons from the paper, and this was supposed to be invariant to orientation. And the temporal memory part, which you can see here in the bottom, the whole goal here was invariant to sampling. If I revisit part of an object I've never seen before, can I identify what object it is no matter where I sampled from, was the main question I wanted to answer. And this is like going back to that same old discussion. How do I turn locations and curvatures, or any real valued items into SDRs? And I used this old technique that was used before. It's called the coordinate encoder strategy, where if I want to basically turn this purple point here into an SDR, I find a neighborhood of points. I find some pink points around that purple point. I randomly pick some of those pink points, hash their values to an SDR. I set those indices as on, and I set the rest as off. This is like one of the strategies for creating an SDR from real valued points. You can do the same exact strategy for curvatures, and that's what I ended up doing. And this is sort of the data that I was working with. I was working with two different kinds of objects. Basically, one where I uniformly sampled this object for training and testing using this clustering technique, where I try to find, what are the optimal training points that I could sample from. And I did the exact same thing in another case, but instead this time the evaluation points are basically small parts of the object. This is what we called occluded objects. So a huge majority of the object would be occluded, and we can only see part of the points during testing. And that's like these green points that you guys see here. So yeah, I went over this briefly in the past. I don't want to go over the specifics of the algorithm all over again, but during inference, what we really want to do is kind of predict the object with the highest total overlap between two sets of cells that we collect. One is the winner cells that we collected during training for these, these curvatures and coordinate pairs. The other set is basically these predicted active cells that we collected during evaluation. And basically the sets that have the highest overlap, you kind of sum them all together and you try to figure out what object was this testing point most likely from. I presented these charts in the past. Hopefully it looks familiar. This was one of the simple experiments that I was running for, evaluating on occluded objects. Basically the question I asked was, how many testing points do I need if I want to get a high testing accuracy if I only see part of the object? And in this very simple experiment, with about, I think, 13 objects and 50 training points, if I had more than 500 points in my non-occluded part of the object, then I would get about 100% testing accuracy. But there's a lot of caveats to this experiment. And that's basically what this slide describes. The locations that I was working with are kind of globally fixed. If the object moves in the environment, then this method completely fails. So something that I wanted to work on next was kind of achieving translation invariance by working with grid cells to encode the location of the sensor on the object surface at any time. And also this kind of hit the nail on the head again about speed issues. Because I was using that C++ temporal memory version, there was only so many objects I could basically ingest data from without speed completely hampering my experiments.
Is it scaling up an instance solution to speed? I know you did some parallelization code, so you just use a larger instance of 200 CPUs. That make it viable?
I don't think I've ever explored parallelizing TM like that over instances.
Not just one instance, but with a lot of cores.
A lot of cores.
With that,
I have no idea.
it was all running local.
Either way, there's that core problem where I'm just creating way too many segments. And like Jeff was saying, I shouldn't probably be doing that.
So on the last slide, before this, do you have the same chart for this is for with occlusion? Sorry.
Yeah, I just
have the same chart for without occlusion.
I didn't.
Is it fewer samples?
It is significantly fewer samples. It's 50 or 100 testing points if it's not occluded. Just because you're also picking uniformly random testing points. It's the perfect case. Okay, even more fun stuff. So I started working on grid cells for the last 2 or so months. And just to recap for everyone, a grid cell module is a term I'm going to be using a lot. And these are basically a set of cells that share the same scale and orientation. Activity across multiple modules can encode unique locations. That's sort of the gist of it. And there's two existing, implementations of grid cells. One uses an anatomically consistent version of grid cells. Basically, you have a rhombus-shaped lattice of these cells. And there's another simpler version that doesn't use these Gaussian estimation processes to determine how the grid cell algorithm works. Instead, you have this very simple rectangular lattice, but it's actually functionally equivalent to the anatomically consistent one. So that's the one I ended up using.
So these were two existing code bases we had?
Yeah.
When I don't remember the rectangular one. When was that created? What was that for?
I believe that was the one that Marcus originally implemented for the columns plus paper, and then in order for the figures to look more biologically kind of relevant, he adapted it to the rhombus one.
Oh, interesting. Because he was a pretty stickler about these things, and I don't remember him ever talking about rectangular lattice, but maybe he did. Okay.
The key thing here is that both of these work for displacements in only 2 dimensions. And I wanted to do this for 3 dimensions. So what I ended up doing was I kind of recreated both of these implementations. They existed in an old version of Python 2. I had to bring them over to Python 3. And I was working on making this grid cell layer, we'll just call it L6A from now on, to work in 3 dimensions, X, Y, and Z. So what I ended up doing was actually not complicated at all. I was just creating groups of grid cell modules where each group would handle path integration along a specific dimension. So as you can imagine, I would have 3 groups.
1 dimension or 2 dimensions?
Along 1 dimension.
Okay, so that's even simpler than the biological ones. So it just
sorry. When I say 1 dimension, sorry, that I shouldn't have written it like that. It's 2 dimensions. It's along like 1 plane. It's along 1 plane. It's along 1 plane, like the
1
X,
plane.
Y
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
this goes back to the paper that Mirko and Marcus and others did, where you had multiple grid cell modules, 2D grid cell modules that created 3D spaces. Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay.
More or less. Yeah. You would create like these groups where each group would handle, I guess, along 1 specific plane. And just for argument's sake, I just provided some numbers here. If I had like 10 modules for each of these groups, each with maybe about 25 cells, I would have about 750 total cells that I was looking at. And one of the key things is that only 1 cell per module could become active. So if you're looking at an SDR that's an output of this grid cell groups, you would look at an SDR that has 30 active bits out of a total of 750.
And the 10 modules, they were different scales and orientations, or were they
There were
identical?
different scales and orientations. Yeah.
Right. So you combine the concept that we had from the frameworks and columns plus paper with the 2D to 3D Mirko Marcus paper.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think these, I did, so just full disclaimer here, I didn't have enough time to run like in-depth detailed experiments, to try to figure out if I change the scale of this module, how would that affect my training results, nothing like that. I really just wanted to get this code up and running as a proof of concept that something like this could work for 3D objects the way we are dealing with them, point clouds. I also borrowed some, I guess, like maybe some anatomic details from the tank paper, where there was a small snippet where scales between successive modules had this multiplier effect of 1.5, something like that. I brought that in here too. I have no idea if that actually contributes something or not, but all this stuff is detailed pretty much in the code.
Just to be clear, that wasn't his idea.
Factors of 1.5.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's an old thing that Tank didn't come up with, just to be clear. That's an empirical observation that was made many years ago.
My bad.
That's all right. He probably mentioned it in the Tank paper, but it wasn't his idea.
Just one question, since you're operating with planes, I don't know, did you get a chance to look at, because I guess if you just use 2 planes, that would be sufficient to specify a point in 3D space.
Yeah, so you're saying like I could do like X and Y and maybe like X and Z or Y and Z basically?
Yeah, I mean, and maybe you have more accuracy or something with 3 planes intersecting, but it might not be necessary.
I was considering that, but I just wanted to go like full on. Just have every combination of every plane possible.
I think
fair enough.
if you do that, if I recall, you end up with, there's nothing wrong with it, but you end up with elongated fields. So it's very easy to get up with elongated fields as opposed to like a spherical. So it's like a cell, where would a cell respond? You'll end up with, classically, if you look at a grid cell in 2D, it's like responds to some circular area. But when you limit the number of dimensions like that, you end up with these elongated fields. It still works. Just point out, but they don't seem to be observed. So.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if the 2 planes are very closely aligned and not orthogonal, then you end up with these sort of elongated fields. If I understand what you're saying.
Okay, I'll try to go through this in some amount of detail. So this is like the training procedure that I ended up using. This is a picture that I borrowed from Niels's paper, where if you look at the top layer, that's the sensor layer. I'm just going to denote that as L4. That's the temporal memory layer. And bottom, the location layer is denoted as L6A, and that's the grid cell layer. So what the algorithm here is trying to do is not strict object classification. It's not, given this object that I have no idea what it is, even though I've trained on a bunch of those similar objects, it's not like I have to identify what that object is. It's not like that. This is instead sort of object recall. If I put my finger or like a sensor along one of these objects that I've seen in the past, can I identify that I'm on that object? So the first step here.
I'm confused, but you could classify it, right? I mean, that wasn't your goal, but once you were able to do that, you can classify it, no?
It's not a strict classification where I can go back and I don't want to use the term I know what you're saying. Like
what I'm saying is that there's this odd thing about all these very sparse representations when we talk about like unique locations, which you're trying to get to unique locations in your grid cell modules. Every unique location is classifiable because it's unique to a particular point on a particular object, but it's unique to that object. So, and the same with the sensory layer. The sensory inputs are represented uniquely in the context of a location on a particular object. So all these things are potentially classifiable. You just maybe didn't do it. You have to learn that temporal pooling layer.
Yeah, that's a much better way of saying it. Yes, thanks.
Okay.
That's also how we use the graph matching for classification. Graph matching does the same thing. You can only tell whether you're on an object you've seen before. So we basically iterate for all the objects we have seen before and see whether we are on any of them. So you could essentially do the same thing here. Right?
Logical next step, yeah. But yeah, the algorithm here was borrowed a lot from the Collins Plus paper, where the first thing here labeled 1, I have a motor input to the grid cell layer. And this grid cell layer is doing this for 3 planes, remember that? So it's doing displacement in parallel for all 3 planes. I provide this motor input to the grid cell layer and I do path integration and I get a set of active cells from this layer. At the same time, after that, I basically get some location representation from the grid cell layer, and that is serving as the basal context for L4. And while that's happening, I feed in some sensory input to L4. In the name of the curvatures. So it's the same curvatures I used in the previous project. And after that is done, you basically get some kind of active representation coming from L4. And the grid cell layer is basically updated back with this new this joint sensory location representation. And one additional thing I added here was at step 5 is you store away this sensory associated location representation to compare against during inference. You're on mute, Jeff.
So I'm sorry. So you're saying you're going to use that representation for classification. Is that right?
Yeah,
you said you stored it for later for inference.
For inference. So
isn't that
I don't.
Is identification kind of closer to what you want?
Yeah, it's more. There's a nuance here that I can't explain between like strict classification. And
classification would say it is an example of a cat as opposed to something specific that I've seen before.
Classification will allow you to generalize, right?
Yeah, I got it. But in this case, it's a distinction. I don't understand how you're making that distinction. Maybe it's not important. I mean, these representations are for particular objects, are they not?
Yes.
So this would be inferring a particular object. I don't know how you'd classify it. Classification says, it seems to me like, oh, this is a location on a particular object. Therefore, it would be inference, not classification in that regard. But
maybe inference is the wrong word here. I guess it's just during the, yeah.
All right, you're storing it away. I'm just saying what you're storing is a unique location on a unique object.
That is correct.
Okay, fine.
But you can you recognize here? So if you do the same thing with the graph matching, let's say I see 10 cats and 10 dogs, and then at inference time I run this and say, this kind of looks like 6 of my dogs, but just 4 of my cats. So it's more likely a dog. Could you introduce that here?
That is absolutely possible. I just didn't.
But I don't understand. I mean, in some sense, at this point, there's no effort to say these two cats are the same. You're just learning objects, and you're going to try to the algorithm will try to see them as different things, won't it? I mean, classification doesn't come for free. You have to put something in there to do that.
Yeah. So what you were describing, Lucas, is yeah, basically what I was doing with the grid cell net stuff. And yeah, this is, yeah, I think more accurately described as recall, because as everyone's kind of saying, it's a specific object that you're identifying.
I'm going to go on to the next step now. Again, I don't know if I should call this inference or not, but in the next stage, when I'm trying to recall a specific object, the same training steps apply. I do the same thing. I pass a motor input. I bias my temporal memory layer. I pass in the sensory input along with that to get some set of active cells. I use that new associated sensory location representation back to tune the cells in my grid cell layer. But the inference rule here is that location sensory representation is only correctly inferred if the inference location representation is a strict subset of the representations you collected during training. In other words, the representations need to have this strict overlap with the ones that I collected before. It's pretty, yeah. It might be naive, but it's pretty straightforward. Okay, I'm gonna go on. This is sort of like the data that I was working with. I didn't have much time to do more than this, but I kind of created these two different kinds of randomly generated points. The first is on the left, where you can see like somewhat of a sequence of continuous paths. If you ignore the red ones, which are used for testing, and only look at the green ones, I can maybe zoom in here a little bit. If you look at the green ones, they're sort of, they're bunched together in this sort of path. So I kind of wanted to mimic what a sensor would be doing if it's going on some kind of continuous path. And I have a series of these paths, all of which I see during training and testing. And similarly, the red points are basically the same. You do the same for when you're doing that evaluation object recall phase. This is the alternative example where I just have like a sequence of uniformly distributed random points for both training and testing. Okay, so I ran a bunch of experiments, but I only wanted to show these two because I guess these are like the ones that I guess you can maybe learn the most from. The first here in the top, where I used 50 paths for both training and testing, where there are kind of these 10 sensations or points per path for a total of 500 sensations on an object. And I used these 4 random objects in my set. And as you can see from the results, I don't have any like nice visualizations to show. All I can show you is what my terminal put out. But for the first object, which is object 10, it was unable to see from those random paths or random sensations, or from the testing sensations, it was unable to draw a correlation with what it collected during training. But it was able to do that for the other objects within a certain number of steps or sensations. The second experiment did the exact same thing, but I used, instead of these paths, I used random sensations. And you can see how quickly you can converge upon a correct representation because you're just covering more of the object. So the chances that you see a testing representation that has the strict overlap or strict subset with the training ones is pretty high. So you're able to converge upon a correct representation for all 4 objects very, very quickly compared to the amount of time it takes for some of those objects in training, which took like maybe 200 steps for one. And that same object takes 1 step to do here when you're looking at random sensations.
That's surprising. The first one actually worked with the paths, because yeah, in the picture you showed before, the paths didn't even look similar. Like, do you know why it worked? Like, there's not really a lot of overlap between the green and the red. There
might not be strict overlap in the points itself, but if it's in a vicinity, like some neighborhood of points, then those STRs will have overlap. So that's why I think happened.
For the uniformly sampled ones, when it shows 1 step, so is there like a 0th step? Does one step mean there's still a like prediction step? You have kind of 2 points, or is that literally just given 1 point?
It's given 1 point. It's given exactly 1 point.
So
Okay.
going back to maybe Vivian's question, can I do that? It looks to me
yeah,
like
sorry.
your green and your red were both done with paths. Is that right? You trained on little paths and you inferred on little paths. Is that right?
Correct. Correct.
So then you can yeah. So then if those paths overall aren't near each other very much, then it's not going to work. I mean, you can, they don't have to be the exact same points, but there's got to be points that are nearby, and so it'd be easy with a small set of these little paths. If the paths aren't near each other, like I see some paths on the tail of the airplane, they're red. I don't see any green ones. Therefore, there's no way in the world it's going to recognize anything back there. So, I mean, you could have had randomly sampled during training and then inferred using paths, and I would think that would work much better. If I'm just trying to understand this, I think that's my observation about that.
That's also valid. I could have done that.
Yeah, I mean, but it's the fact that in some sense, the fact you're doing these short paths, it's like you're just highly undersampling the thing, because you've got a whole bunch of points in one space and then a whole bunch of points in another space, and they're not evenly distributed, and therefore the intersection between the inference and the learning path could be very low.
So in my head, maybe I was wrong about thinking it like this, but I was thinking of creating like this realistic training scenario where if I'm looking at a novel object, I'm not running my finger to random points on that object to try to understand it. I'm going along this continuous path, for maybe part of the object, moving to a different part, touching that in a continuous path. That's what I wanted to replicate.
But that's a kind of impoverished learning strategy. I mean, reality is we typically focus on areas of interest, things that are unique and different. You typically, during learning, you would cover the entire object. I mean, I can't learn what that airplane is unless I've somehow sampled all parts of it, even briefly. So it'd be sort of like imagining I was looking at this object and I had to look through a series of little holes. I have my vision is restricted to a series of little holes, and the holes are pretty small, and that's all I can see. And then when I'm inferring, I'm looking through a different set of little holes, and they may not be overlapping much. If I could have learned the entire object, then observing only part of it during inference would have worked better. Anyway, it's okay. I think that is probably not the wisest choice for a learning strategy. But I at least can see why it wouldn't work very well.
Those points there are just the scope of that local feature, right? If you imagine a fat finger and you're taking swaths across it, so you're seeing more coarse representation of the thing, there's a greater chance that you would have some kind of intersection that would kind of, if you're blind and you're taking this object in your hand and rolling around in it, it's like Jeff said, you'll basically cover all the interesting extensions of the object and then smooth here and stuff like that. So it's going to be a lot denser than just kind of, I'm finding a point feature here. So
yeah.
Just
right,
make it more realistic.
And that brings up a good point, because something we've never really tried, but we've suspected and we've written about is, we do have in sensory modalities in vision and touch, you have regions of the cortex that have different scales at which they work with. And, one way to look at that is they're hierarchical. The other way, as we propose, you can look at them as just modeling the object in different resolutions. And so you could say, oh, I have multiple models of this airplane. One is a very fuzzy resolution, which gives me the overall, it's hard I can't really get details on it, but I get the overall shape because my points are kind of big. And then you could say, oh, and then the finer resolution region will focus on things that require finer resolution. So I can learn maybe the detail of the propeller curvature, but I wouldn't learn the overall the details of the fuselage or something like that. So there's other ways we could address these issues. I just don't want to be too much into the fact that it didn't work well in this case.
When you sense a point, do you get any features there, or like, do you only get locations? So if you recognize the object from just one sensation, is that just because it's a pretty unique feature, or is it because you're using an absolute coordinate system and it's only that object exists in this location?
So there's no absolute coordinate system here. The only feature you can get is the curvature. And I'm assuming that if in those cases where it does only work in one sensation, it's because it's something that it pretty much saw during training.
But Vivian asked a separate question, which is are the locations absolute? I mean, do you just assume the plane's in the same reference frames in both cases?
Oh, wait, is it a question about reference frame, or is it a question of if it's fixed, if there's like a global fixed location, like how I did in my past temporal memory project?
Yeah, I guess both. I'm just trying to figure out how you would recognize an object from just one sensation.
Okay, so it's using a fixed reference frame for sure, because if I rotated this object, it would not work. The grid cells are yeah, there's a fixed reference frame, but at the same time, it's not using a fixed object coordinate location like I was doing in the past. So if I wanted to look at one sensation, I'm pretty sure it worked in those cases because that particular sensation was something I saw pretty much similarly during training. It was like very nearby. It was a unique curvature, and yeah, there was a lot.
But nearby assumes that you have this absolute reference frame, right? It's like it's saying like you don't have to infer which grid cells are active in each module.
Yeah, he said it was a fixed reference frame, so yeah. But to Vivian's question, the feature he's looking at is curvature, not a point coordinate.
Got it, but you do have the location of the coordinate of that feature.
Yeah, presumably, but it's a if you miss by a little bit and you're still part of that curvature shape, then you might still have a close match. So I guess it depends upon what the scale of the curvature is that you're taking it over, as to how restricted it is, how close you have to land to it and say, oh, this is a curvature I recognize in roughly this location.
Correct. That goes back to my coordinate encoder strategy that I was talking about before. To find a neighborhood of points, anything within that neighborhood or that real value neighborhood, that's something you consider overlap for.
Right. So you don't have to have an exact match. It's
yeah, I got
still
it.
have some scope.
I don't want to beat this too much, but imagine I had only one object actually occupied the location 0, 0, 0 in these graphs here, although the axes are not the same here. But imagine there's only one object that occupies 0, 0, 0. All the other objects didn't come close to it. Therefore, the question is, if I detected a feature at 0, 0, 0, and that even if I say that feature has to be the same feature, but that's how you could uniquely identify it. You say, oh, I have this curvature here, but this is the only object that has a curvature in that location. That's how I interpreted Vivian's question. And I think you were doing that, right?
But that shouldn't be happening here if grid cells are being used. I mean, that should be an internal reference frame. Even if you may have kept the objects fixed in the environment at training and inference, it should still be an internal reference frame.
But then I don't.
But then
if you just have one location and you have curvature,
yeah.
I mean, curvature should be the same everywhere on the outside of the cup, basically. So
yeah, so that's the thing. I think it'd be worth checking, Abhi, like how big the location representation is at inference time, because in my mind, on the first sensation, you're not going to be predicting anything in the feature layer. So all of the cells in any given mini column are going to light up. So you should, like, pretty much no matter what, be getting lots of location cells becoming active. And so I'd be surprised if you can do it in one sensation, but maybe with sufficiently small training, like few objects rather.
How many objects did you use, Abhi?
There's only 4.
4.
Not many.
And did you test for translation invariance?
I didn't have a test for translation invariance, but like this is translation invariant the way I'm using grid cells.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff, were you asking something? I think you were on mute.
I was just making a funny comment. You said there's only 4 objects, but I'm looking at object 75 and object 45. So it's I get it. It's just funny.
So on the first sensation or first data point, how does the grid code activations get established?
So in the very beginning, the grid cell anchors at a completely random point. So
What do you mean by point? Point on the
no, not
cloud?
point here, not point here. Point in the grid cell space. You anchor somewhere randomly in that point. Then you
Hang on, are you talking about inference or training?
inference, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In inference?
In both
Okay.
inference
That's
and
not what
training.
happens at inference.
Okay, how's it?
In inference, do you not activate a random point in the grid space, compute the displacement to that point?
No, at the start of inference, the first sensation will activate. So let's say like columns 2, 7, and 20 of the, or like mini columns, those ones receive inputs. All of the sensory cells are going to become active in those mini columns because you don't have any prediction, because you don't have a location representation. And then all of those cells will have some learned association with a grid cell. And so that input is gonna drive a bunch of grid cells to become active. And then on the next step, all those grid cells are gonna be updated with path integration. They predict next sensation. And then hopefully at this point is when you get the like paring down of representations.
Okay, that is a nuance that I might not have implemented then.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, this you had to do a lot of stuff in only a couple days, huh? Yeah, don't worry.
Yeah.
So that would be translation and rotation invariant, right?
Not rotation, just translation.
Well,
No,
I think it's a general question is you just don't know your location. You have to infer what the right anchoring of the grid cells is, regardless of what they're representing. And you weren't doing
Yeah,
that.
I guess I'm sorry.
You weren't narrowing down the possible set of active grid cells, which is, I think, what the general idea is.
Yeah,
And just I guess regarding what you were saying, Phil, yeah, in my mind at least, rotation invariance doesn't fall out automatically because you don't necessarily know how you're moving relative to the features and your learned representation. So you either need to kind of test lots of possible orientations that you could have relative to the object, or kind of try and infer that somehow.
Right, I see.
But translation invariance should be, yeah, kind of automatic.
Okay. Yeah, so this is, I guess, like the last slide. This is just based off of the experiments that I was running, what I think could be interesting to do next. The first is probably some kind of intelligent action selection. We've been talking about this a lot, but it seems useful here. Instead of having those naive paths that I collected during training, I could possibly do some kind of action selection to maximize the most information gain. And also probably more realistic grid cell architectures instead of the groups that I created here. It feels almost inefficient to use this many grid cell modules to reconstruct 3D space. I was talking with Vivian about this yesterday, about an idea. I think Jeff, you and Vivian were talking about this briefly. Maybe unwrapping 3D meshes of objects into 2D sheets and using grid cells in standard 2 dimensions. I was thinking about this maybe a bit further too, where, if that unwrapping is really challenging, you can just project it onto view spheres, which I think Niels was describing maybe 3-4 months ago, and just deterministically unwrap the sphere, there's a known solution to that problem. And you could just
I think both have challenges. So
Yeah, you can unwrap a sphere, but then you have to pick your distortions.
Oh.
You lose angle or you use area. Mapping it's just a known problem. A sphere is not what they call not composable, but there's a problem with projection.
Yeah, there's an intrinsic curvature. You cannot.
yeah, I think Vivian and I were talking about an idea that I wouldn't say it was brief. It was pretty complicated and long, but how you can have locally 2D. You assume that locally in 2D everything is planar, but over longer distances it's not at all. And so how could you represent complex shapes using grid cell type mechanisms, but you just have to assume there's a way. It seemed like there's a way of doing it where you can't make long distance movements reliably. You have to sort of the local movements you assume are linear or close to linear. It's a long topic, but it wasn't a simple idea.
The term I was trying to pick up was a developable surface. That's one that can be mapped to a plane without distortion.
What was it? What was the words you used there, Kevin?
I'm trying to make an adjective out of develop.
Oh, okay.
Developable.
Developable.
Yeah. So I mean, it's there are some surfaces that you can unfold onto a plane without distortion.
This is this is I think probably even more complex than that because we're trying to take any kind of surface. Anyway, what we were trying to do was understand how, if we just accept the fact that we apparently don't have 3D grid cell modules. There's no evidence that they work like grid cell modules when you're in 3D. Then how could you actually learn three-dimensional objects? And so that was the challenge we were looking at.
Okay, that's it. That's it. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Abhi.
I want to see Porky Pig. Where's Porky Pig? He's supposed to come out anyway.